Welcome to the Wired to Hunt Foundations podcast, your guide to the fundamentals of better deer hunting. Presented by First Light, creating proven, versatile hunting apparel for the stand, saddle, or blind. First Light. Go farther, stay longer. And now, your host, Tony Peterson.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Wired to Hunt Foundations podcast, which is brought to you by First Light. I'm your host, Tony Peterson, and today's episode is all about building a rut hunting plan and following through with it. I have a question for all you listeners. Why are you tuning into this podcast this week when you should be in a tree? Now, maybe you're listening, in the morning on the way to an all-day sit, and I can forgive you for that. In fact, I encourage it. But otherwise, I don't know. This is the week of all weeks. The great equalizer is upon us. The rut is here. Things are busting loose. It's cold as hell in many places. And if you have time to sit, you better get out there and sit. But don't do it without at least a loose plan. That's what this episode is about. And while it might feel a little late to be talking about some of this stuff, it's not. Listen up and you'll see what I mean. I'd say, about 8 years ago, I figured I'd do something nice for Mother's Day, which also happens to fall right around my anniversary. As a two-for gift to my bride, I thought I'd address the dismal landscaping situation in our front yard. So instead of going fishing or turkey hunting, I waited for my wife to load up the girls and head up to the lake. I stayed home and went to one of those giant landscaping businesses with all kinds of rocks and pavers and decorative yard crap. Now, our house isn't big, and it's, not exactly some kind of architectural experiment. It's a 3-bedroom split level, so it's basically a big rectangle. I thought I'd go buy some block to frame in 2 little rock beds in the front around our front steps, and then, spruce them up with some kind of flowers or shrubs or something. And since I did a little bit of landscaping in my youth, I figured that it would be a simple job. And a lot of things are simple for some people. Like using a ratchet strap correctly. For others, those tasks are anything but simple. When I returned home from the first trip to the big shop of blocks and rocks, I framed out the 2 sections and realized I was short by a lot. No biggie. I just made the round trip back to the shop and swiped the credit card again. And when I finally got the blocks truly framed out, I did some quick, terrible math and went back and bought a load of rock to fill the whole thing in. I undershot that by 2 trips worth. It started to become one of those projects that made me really miss drinking. I finally got blocks and rocks squared away and drove to a giant greenhouse to buy some plants. Now, what I know about decorative plants couldn't max out the character length of a tweet. So after seeking some help, I drove home with 7 perennials that were destined to be beautiful and produce flowers every year. And after planting them, I stood back to admire my work. What should have been a testosterone-heavy moment where I should have been able to feel my manly chest hair growing after the ape task I had just completed became something else. Mostly because it looked really bad. I didn't stake out the block so I could follow a truly straight line. And me eyeballing a line of block and getting it right would be about like Kenyon trying to shoot a booner on Michigan public land with a homemade recurve. Not going to happen, my friends. So I basically kind of redid the whole thing, and it looked passable, but definitely not professional. Any tradesmen listening to this, you're right to smirk or directly talk shit about me. I deserve it, and I totally get it. I should have had a plan. I should have actually measured things out and figured out the materials I was going to need, and then I should have followed that plan. What I did instead was assume I could do this thing that seemed so simple on the surface, but actually requires some skill, and I dove headlong in without a plan. Now, I'm pretty sure you know where I'm going with this. The rut is here, and yes, you should have a plan. Let me start with the part of the plan you should have taken care of a long time ago, but if you didn't, it's okay. You can still address this. Most of the hunters I know, they just kind of set stands and blinds for general deer movement throughout the season. And that's what they hunt from, September to December or whatever their season framework is. And that can work, but it often doesn't. I think a better bet is to hang rut stands or set out rut blinds. Here's why. If you think that field edge stand you've set a bunch of times is going to be flush with cruising bucks, it probably won't. You've probably educated some of the bucks and many of the does to that ambush spot. If the does are onto you, they're not going to drag a buck by. You could still catch a random cruiser because it is still the rut, but the odds are less than if you had different setups to work with. This is a common mistake that hunters make, and they often know it. This is why it's so common to dip into the old bag of tricks, start rattling or grunting or using a decoy or whatever. The stands they are hunting probably won't naturally funnel a bunch of rut-crazy bucks by, so they try to spruce them up with some get-rich-quick products. This is often one of those lipstick on a pig situations. Trust me on this. There are times when sitting a tried-and-true stand during the rut is plenty good enough. That's up for you to decide. But if you don't have other options, you won't have a choice, and that's no bueno. And you know how I feel about not giving yourself options. It's a bad move, and it'll bite you in the ass every time. The truth is, there are some spots that are just rut spots. The pinch points and funnels and terrain traps are the places to be. The soft edges in the big woods, great places to be. The high spine that bisects the swamp and allows deer to stay mostly dry while cruising through, great place to be. The place where the river bluff pinches up next to the bank. Well, you get it. You know this stuff. I know you know this. But do you do this? Do you have a setup or a plan to go into a spot like this for the rut? If not, you better consider it. I think that we view the rut as a situation where deer could show up anywhere. But mostly, lots of deer show up in very specific spots, while few deer show up wherever. You want to be on one of those high concentration spots where lots of deer should go. It is that simple. Now, as I lay these words down on a digital tablet, I'm packing up for a trip to North Dakota to hunt for 6 days. My plan, after almost too much time on onX, is going to be that I'm going to spend some time in 3 spots. I have 3 really interesting pinch points marked that should allow for all-day sits if the wind cooperates. Now, I know that at least one of those spots will probably have other hunters around because it's public, so I'm not even counting on being able to utilize all 3. But they are all 3 true rut spots. You probably wouldn't sit any of them in September or at least early October, but now you would. And my plan is simple there. Go hang and hunt where the wind is best and the sign is plentiful, and then comes phase 2 of the plan. This involves something that we talk about a lot, but we don't break down very much, which is just watching deer. I know I've talked about this before, but if you have a buck nose his way through the woods, pay attention to it. I mean, if you don't, maybe go golfing or something, because I don't know if bow hunting's the right sport for you. I've said this a lot, but every deer you see during the rut gives you an advantage. Obviously, the buck that crosses the down fence in the woods exactly where you expect him to is great. It's great affirmation for your strategy. But there's a benefit to watching a buck cross 100 yards farther down, too. Or the doe that walked out into the alfalfa field at 3 p.m. all by herself. What she did today, she might do tomorrow. And you can bet your ass that eventually someone is going to want to give her a little sniff to see if she might swipe right, if you get my drift. The forky that crosses an open field from one point of woods to another. Or, I don't know, the 2-year-old that travels through the middle of a cattail slough where you can see a small band of willows. All of that movement tells you something. Now, you might be thinking that these sightings tell you to move, but they don't, at least not always. This is where phase 2 of the rut plan meets an old fork in the road. Remember those get-rich-quick products I just made fun of a little bit ago? Well, you might need them now. If you have a pretty good rut setup, but for some reason the deer prefer to be 75 yards away instead of 20, you have 2 options. Move to them or try to move them to you. Sometimes it's easy. Sometimes it's nothing more than pulling your set and moving 50 yards to a good tree where the action actually is. This is my go-to strategy first. If I can put myself where the deer like to move, I've damn near won the game. But what if you're on the edge of that cattail slough and you see that 2-year-old and some other deer using that willow band, but you don't really want to wade in there and try to arrow one from the ground because you're not going to make that happen? In that situation, moving to them just might not be a viable option. You might have to try to get them to come to you. I ran into this, I don't know, maybe a dozen years ago in Nebraska during a public land hunt. The bucks kept cruising and chasing through a small patch of pines in the CRP, but wouldn't come to where I could hang a stand. So I eventually used a feeding doe decoy one morning to see if I could get a deer's attention, and it worked. I had to call to him and I had to work him in, but the 8-pointer I arrowed that morning, he was following the exact script of several other bucks I saw. He wasn't going to come my way, but then he saw a deer. or he thought he saw a deer. Then he heard a deer, or he thought he heard a deer. Well, it wasn't much for him to make a little bit of a detour, and it was like November 6th, so he swung in there. If I could have moved to the best patch of cedars there to set up, I would have. But it wasn't an option, so it was time to get a little crafty. This is important, my friends. If you're not right on the sweet spot, but you're close, read the situation. Read it really well, and make note of the wind and other conditions. Ask yourself why they're there, and if they are likely to get to you. If you don't think so, ask yourself, what's my best move? Can you really locate to the action with a stand or a saddle or maybe a natural ground blind? If so, do that. Honestly, don't wait. Just get there and make it happen. But if you can't, which is pretty common, it might be time for a little calling or a decoy or some scents or whatever. Now, I need to move on to phase 3 here of the plan, and it's one that I kind of wish didn't exist, but it just does. It's what to do when you're just not on deer, even though you believe you should be. This one happens to me a lot, and I think it happens to a lot of us more than we'd care to admit. I'm a firm believer that if I give a spot a full day's sit or one afternoon and then a morning sit and it doesn't produce, I'm probably going to move. Scratch that. I'm at least going to consider moving. This is just a gut feeling type of thing. But if you believe the terrain is going to feed deer to you at some point, 2 days of sitting or even 3, it just might be necessary, especially if you're in a low deer density area. It's all up to your confidence and faith in the spot. And you have to be real honest with yourself, because this is when laziness can weigh in on the decision-making process. It's far more work to go looking and try to find deer and the next best setup. In that case, it's much easier to keep sitting the same spot and trying to convince yourself that it's just a matter of time. This is a common mindset, and it leaves a lot of tags unfilled. When I hit that moment where I'm just like, it is not happening here for some reason, my first instinct is to move. Unless my options are really limited, like I'm hunting a small property or the conditions for whatever reason won't allow for a fresh setup, I'm going to go to my next spot. This is kind of where we go back to phase 1. If you did your homework, you should have a few other rut spots you believe in. They might not be your number one choice, but you should have faith in them. If the first setup doesn't produce and you have other options, it is just a matter of sitting somewhere else. If you don't have another site prepped and ready to go, don't fret. You can sneak in and scout around for some fresh sign. I like lots of rubs, and if I can find it, big running tracks on trails in the woods. A spot with both of those that allows me to set up with a good wind, that's pretty much all I need when I don't have other options. Now, before I wrap this up, I just want to say a few things. The first is, develop some kind of plan for yourself if you can. I mean that. The second is to understand when you're sabotaging yourself for some reason. This is most common when we decide not to hunt. I know I've said this before, but how many times have you heard someone saying it's just not worth sitting during the rut because it's too hot or too windy or whatever? There's no such thing. Don't make excuses to not hunt. The only thing you'll do is pretend that you're being a wise deer hunter while dumber deer hunters are out enjoying the woods and killing deer. This is maybe the most important part of the whole thing. Get your head ready for a real rut hunt. That's what a plan does for you. That hunt where you're going to blank and have the wrong wind and watch hunters walk through the best bedding areas. The one where you don't want to wake up and sit all day for another whole day when your bed is warm and cozy and you're a sleepy little bear. Get up and go hunt. A plan, having a good plan, that's going to help you with this. Like, keep going, keep doing your thing. Tell yourself that you're going to find a way to maximize all the available time you have. Because you know what? For most of us, at least who don't live too far south, it's already damn near over. In a couple of weeks, the whole thing will fizzle down into that time of the season when it's just about impossible to see a deer bigger than a forky. When we hit that point, will you look back on the rut and think about it in a positive way? Or will it mostly be a reminder of unmet expectations? You don't want that, do you? I know I don't, and I've lived it enough to try really hard to make sure it doesn't happen to me. Listen, I still have bad days and bad sits and bad weeks during the rut. I don't think you can get away from that if you hunt anywhere with a decent amount of pressure anyways. but I think you can always grind it out on the promise that a good one will eventually come down the trail, or that you might have one of those magical once-per-decade mornings where a hot doe brings the whole crew to your feet and the action you witness is so awesome it can erase tons of difficult sits and other bad deer hunts. Make a loose plan based around your existing setups and whatever potential setups you could have in the moment. Pay attention to the deer. They'll tell you damn near everything you need to know. And lastly, put in the time. Don't be like your competition and phone it in, but really get out there and log in those hours. You won't regret it. I promise you that. And finally, come back next week because I'm going to talk about gun hunting for deer. I know I've covered this topic a few times, but I got a few things I want to talk about that I haven't covered before so we can get into giving our orange-clad brothers and sisters a little bit of love. That's it for this week. I'm Tony Peterson, and this has been the Wired to Hunt Foundations podcast, which is brought to you by First Light. As always, thank you so much for listening and for all of your support. All of us here at Meat Eater really, really appreciate it. If you want some more deer hunting content, you can head on over to themeateater.com and you will see tons of articles, tons of podcasts, video series, you name it. And it's not just whitetail content over there. If you want to scratch that elk itch and plan for a hunt next year or whatever, it's all there at themeateater.com. Thank you again so much.